November 18th, 1863, Abraham Lincoln stays in this hotel behind me, which is actually a house, a private house, David Will's house. And then the next day on the 19th, he makes his journey from here to where the National Cemetery would be located. We're going to take that trip out there today and walk the same ground to get to the cemetery. As we move along here on this walk, I'll try to go through some of the information about the battle and about how we get to the point of Gettysburg Address. 3 days in July of 1863, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, both the Confederate and Union Army met here at this place. The total strength was 94,000 men for the Army of the Potomac, and for the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, 72,000 men. By the end of the 3 days' battles, the Union Army would lose 3,155 soldiers killed, 14,529 wounded, and 5,365 missing and captured, a total of 23,049 soldiers. The Confederate Army would have 3,903 soldiers killed, 18,735 wounded, and 5,425 missing and captured, for a total of 28,063 casualties. Over the course of that time, you have roughly almost 7,000 soldiers in the field out here dead. The amount of dead people, dead horses, dead animals, and the carnage that was on this field was great. It was massive. So it came a point in time when they had to figure out what they were going to do with all these bodies. Initially, a lot of soldiers were put in shallow graves on these fields, and through time, those bodies would resurface. But eventually an idea came up that they needed to create a cemetery for the Union soldiers that fought here. Established in 1863 at the behest of Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin and under the direction of Gettysburg attorney David Wills, the Gettysburg Soldiers National Cemetery was created in order to provide a proper burial place for the Union soldiers who gave their lives during these battles. Today, the cemetery remains a final resting place for more than 6,000 soldiers and many of their spouses, too. Although nearly half of the burials are of the Civil War dead, and primarily those who died at Gettysburg, veterans of all American armed conflicts, from the Spanish-American War through Vietnam, are also buried here within this cemetery. It was closed to further burials in 1972, however, and exceptions are still occasionally made for burial of spouses of those who are already interred here. Now, as you can see, as I move along here, I'm crossing the streets and I'm moving up the same pathway that Abraham Lincoln would have traveled going towards this cemetery that was planned out. On that day, there was a large procession, a parade, if you will, of soldiers and civilians moving in this direction. And also Abraham Lincoln. He came up in this direction as well. I'm sure as he was walking this way that he was probably feeling some sort of way. What exactly he was feeling we will never know, because nothing was ever written and he never really spoke about it, other than the few things that he said in passing to people. One can imagine walking around out here, there would have probably still been some sort of signs of battle scars and death and destruction out here in these streets and on these fields when Abraham Lincoln came to town. One witness to the battle actually said that the scene of horror and desolation which humanity in all its centuries has seldom witnessed. That's a pretty bold statement to say about any battle. The landscape itself was scarred and devastated and littered by debris. The air was filled with the piteous cries of the many thousands of wounded and dying men who were being cared for throughout the town and the countryside, while those soldiers who survived the storm of battle silently went about the grim and ghastly work of, essentially, burying the dead. Now, Governor Andrew Curtin actually traveled out here about a week after the battle, and he said the heart sickened at the sights that presented themselves at every step. The remains of our brave partially covered with earth, while others were left wholly unburied. Recognizing that something needed to be done, Curtin called upon the Gettysburg acquaintance and his political ally, 33-year-old David Wills, and charged him with the great task of providing a more fitting and more proper burial place for thousands of Union soldiers who gave their lives here at Gettysburg. Wills went to work with great energy, and he very quickly raised enough money to secure the purchase of 17 acres of ground on the hilltop that we're going to today. And it was the ground adjoining the Evergreen Cemetery. Wills next hired William Saunders, a noted landscape architect, who set about designating the physical layout of the cemetery, as well as Samuel Weaver, a contractor who, with his team of laborers, went to work exhuming the remains of thousands of Union soldiers scattered for miles around in the hastily dug makeshift graves, and then he reburied them here. Finally, Wills orchestrated the dedication ceremony, which occurred here November 19th of 1863. It was during this ceremony that President Abraham Lincoln, who had been invited by Wills to formally set apart these grounds and their sacred use by a few appropriate remarks, rose to deliver what is still widely regarded as the single greatest speech in American history, the Gettysburg Address. And although Lincoln spoke for fewer than 3 minutes, his 272-word-long Gettysburg Address has long since become woven into the fabric of the nation. At the location I'm at right now, this tree that's behind me and the building is actually a witness to that march up here to the cemetery for Gettysburg Address. In historic photos, you can actually see this building in the background, along with the house across the street. And that tree right there over my shoulder is a witness tree. Now, had you been here on the afternoon of November 19th, 1863, you would have been one of 15,000 people who had journeyed here to attend the dedication and witness the ceremony that had been orchestrated by David Wills. One of the witnesses here said that all about were traces of the fierce conflict. Rifle pits, cut and scarred trees, broken fences, pieces of artillery wagons and harness, scraps of blue and gray clothing, bent canteens, abandoned knapsacks, belts, cartridge boxes, shoes, and caps were still to be seen on nearly every side, a great showing for relic hunters. So you can imagine walking these streets, going up and down, and in the area that we're in right now, this is closer to the outskirts of town, so some of these houses were not here at that time. And coming up here pretty soon on the left-hand side, you'll see the house where Jenny Wade actually perished during the battle. But it's pretty amazing to think that as these people, months after the battle was over with, are walking these streets, they're still seeing many things here left over from the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, on this day, you would have seen many governors of northern states out here, along with Edward Everett, the guest speaker. President Abraham Lincoln wasn't even the main attraction or the main speaker. Instead, 69-year-old Edward Everett, like I said, was a former statesman and a one-time Secretary of State. He was the most noted and celebrated orator of his day. Everett was Will's first choice when planning for this event, which was originally planned and intended to take place October 23rd. Everett, however, declared that he would not be ready by that date and requested that the ceremony be pushed back, which explains why the dedication was November 19th instead. It was not even until after the change in the dates that Wills invited President Lincoln to attend and deliver some short words or appropriate remarks to formally set apart the grounds for their sacred use. So, fate would have it, Abraham Lincoln makes his way over here, just simply by a small request, and this is after the date was pushed back. Now, on this afternoon, Everett captures the crowd with a 2-hour-long, 13,000-word oration, and he recited it entirely from memory, during which he not only paid homage to the dead, but also provided a detailed examination of the great battle fought here. It was following Edward's masterful oratory that President Lincoln then rose to deliver his famed address. And contrary to the much popular thought, Lincoln did not hurriedly compose his address on the train ride, nor the night before while staying as a guest at David Will's house. Instead, sensing the importance of the occasion, Lincoln went to work crafting his speech immediately after receiving Will's invitation 2 weeks earlier. But unlike Everett, Lincoln did not have his speech memorized. Thus, if you'd been standing here and you were close enough to hear Lincoln's words, you probably would have seen the top of his head as he was looking down at a piece of paper to read his speech. And while Lincoln did pay tribute to the fallen, he used Gettysburg Address more as a rallying cry for the nation, imploring people of a torn and bitterly divided North to dedicate themselves to the great task remaining. So, like a good politician, he used this opportunity to speak to that crowd and to try to get them to rally around what he saw as an extremely important situation and moment in time. Try to get them to rally around the conclusion, to try to see this war through and bring the states back together. Now, at the end of this, Lincoln, he didn't receive much widespread acclaim, but afterwards, Edward Everett praised Lincoln's address, and he famously wrote to the president, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." Those are some pretty bold words and very flattering words coming from someone who was considered the greatest orator of their time. And we're talking about a speech here that's just over 2 minutes long. Since the date of its delivery, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address has become one of the most famous speeches in American history. Many believe it revolutionized the nation, and it was spoken here, just beyond these gates. We're going to make our way over to where the actual famed speech was made, and it would have just been a few yards past where this black fence is. It's over on the left-hand side, and you'll see, looking out towards the actual Evergreen Cemetery, that the platform would have been placed out there somewhere, not actually in here inside the National Cemetery It's a pretty moving place to be. Now, as you walk out here on this field, around this cemetery, you can see many graves that are marked unknown. Unknown 143 bodies, unknown 15 bodies, and so on and so forth. And they're usually buried roughly in the same position of where their state was. One soldier that's buried in the unknowns is Sergeant Alexander Siders, Company K, 151st Pennsylvania Volunteers. And he was killed out here in Gettysburg. And his wife did make an attempt to try to get his body, but he was buried in a grave out here, and just like many of the other soldiers, there was nothing on him to identify him. So it's likely that he's buried out here too. Another soldier that was buried out here that actually has a grave that's marked is Lieutenant Edmund Dascom. And he's buried out here with his state as well, with New Hampshire. And then of course there are privates like Pliny Fisk White with Company 14th Vermont Infantry, who's buried out here. As you come out here to these fields and you walk around, then you see these graves, which are coming up here on the right hand side. Take a moment to pause and just look at them and realize what's there. These soldiers are here, far from their homes, far from where their families were buried, and the only people around were fellow soldiers to bury them and the civilians at Gettysburg. That was their family at the time. And if you come out here and you know a name and say it, then perhaps maybe you make them live on. So here we are, early morning in Gettysburg, in the cemetery, and I'm roughly in the position where the platform would have been built for that famous speech, the Gettysburg Address. Some argue that it was probably the most famous speech in the world. When Lincoln was here and he gave that speech, the crowd went silent. Nobody made a sound for a short period of time after he sat down. And according to one eyewitness, he went to sit down and he talked to his bodyguard and he said, "It won't scour," meaning he wasn't pleased with his speech and that he didn't think that this speech was good enough for the occasion. But by all accounts, it said exactly what he wanted to say. And it was more with less words than the 13,000 words Edward Everett muttered here at the cemetery for 2 hours. And today we still talk about that speech. Many have it memorized. Not many know what Edward Everett said. It's a pretty powerful speech. We're out here at the National Cemetery tonight to take a look at the luminary and the graves and the honor that's given to the fallen soldiers here in Gettysburg National Cemetery.
Company D, 19th Maine. Sergeant Enoch C. Dow. Company E, 19th Maine. Sergeant W. S. Jordan. Company G, 20th Maine.
Being out here among so many lights, understanding that each one of them represents a life lost here at Gettysburg. It's awe-inspiring. Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Abraham Lincoln, November 19th, 1863. Yet again, it's been another great trip out here to Gettysburg, as usual. Hope you enjoyed the video about the luminary, the cemetery, Gettysburg Address. And hopefully the video on Pickett's charge turns out pretty good for you. Gives you a little bit more information. Once again, come out here, check this place out. Till next time, History with Waffles.